let everybody know what's going to come. Adhyayan was set up basically as a movement of school leaders who were interested in the quality of education, school-based education largely, in a way that was inclusive of all stakeholders, in a way that said, how do we understand what a good school looks like in terms of the research that's available in the world, as well as the practice that people have demonstrated. And that's been a journey for the last 8 years that we've been on, which has been very exciting, adding schools by the hundreds, not just by the dozen. And eventually we have, of course, been a part of the COVID response where we have been looking at how schools need to go online and what kind of work does a school leader need to do to make sure that their school is ready, implementing learning, whatever the distance learning or online learning is required, as well as knows how to sustain the learning that has to happen in their school so that children at no point feel they've been left out or that they are not in touch with teachers and with their schools. So with that, which is a very broad spectrum of work that we're doing, we also collaborated with ASCD, which is based in the US. And of course, everybody is aware of the fact that it's one of the largest organizations with chapters right across the world. And the chapter in India is being opened by us. We are therefore really lucky to have Carol with us as part of that initial introduction of ASCD and the work that educators have been doing, who are educators that we've all looked up to, listened to, and read, as well as practiced parts of what they've said. But for the first time, we're actually getting to meet with them, interact with them, and that's really exciting. So today, our guest speaker is Carol Ann Tomlinson, a William Clay Parrish Junior Professor and Chair of Educational Leadership Foundations and Policy at the University of Virginia's Curry School of Education. Before that, she was a public school teacher for 21 years, teaching students in high school, preschool, and middle school, administered district programs for struggling and advanced learners, and was Virginia's Teacher of the Year in 1974. In her years, she's done prolific amounts of writing, 300 books, chapters, articles, other educational materials. 2 of them have gone into more editions. How to Differentiate Instruction in Academically Diverse Classrooms is in its 3rd edition. The Differentiated Classroom, Responding to the Needs of All Learners in its 2nd edition. And with Tonya Moon, the Assessment and Student Success in Differentiated Classroom that she's going to be referring to today. Her books on differentiation are available in 14 languages. And she works throughout the United States and internationally with educators who seek to create classrooms that are more effective for academically diverse students. We're really excited to have her now in India. And welcome, Carol. Over to you.
Thank you. I appreciate all of you taking time late in your day to spend some time with me, and particularly putting up with my strange accent. Not only is it not quite as pretty as yours, but it's also a Southern US accent, which makes it a little odder even. So I hope you can hang in with me. My goal for today is to introduce you to the topic of differentiation through the lens that I use to see it. No doubt some of you are already familiar in doing, all teachers do some things to differentiate whether they know the word or not. So my goal is not to show you how to do all of this. It's certainly not to scare you away by sharing too many things with you, but just to give you sort of an appetizer, just a little bit of a preview of how I came to think as I do and some of the ways that I got to that point. So what I want to do is to first begin by sharing my journey with you just a little bit, so you have some sense that this is something that happened to a human being and in some classrooms, not just through a textbook. When I was growing up, I had no idea what I wanted to do when I finished growing up. And of course, adults ask you that all the time, at least in this country. And so my response to them was always the same. When they said, "What would you like to do?" I said, "I will never be a teacher." And the reason for that was that I ended up in the same school that my mother was in sixth grade. She was a teacher, and I was there in sixth grade, and it was a very awkward year for me, as adolescents can be. She was a wonderful mother. The teachers were good teachers. Nobody did anything wrong, but at dinner at night, she would say something just casually that let me know that somebody had told her something that I had done during the day. Nothing bad, because I was way too good to do that, but just really a problem to me, that I was feeling watched all the time. And that just turned me off of teaching. So my vow was never to teach. Consequently, when I went to the university, I didn't study how to teach. And then when I started teaching by accident, I had no idea what I was doing at all. And I think most of what I thought I knew about teaching, I thought I knew because I had been watching my own teachers for a long time. That's not always a very good way to learn how to teach when you're the kid and they're the teacher and you think you understand what's going on. At any rate, in my first couple of years of teaching, I learned a lot. I got a little bit better, grew to understand a little more about what teaching was, and totally loved being with the kids. I absolutely adored that from the beginning. The idea of doing different things for different kids didn't occur to me. I certainly realized that some kids were doing well in my class and some kids were doing poorly. And I felt badly for the kids who kept doing poorly. And I somehow felt good because kids that seemed smart were doing well. There was no logic to that, but because the smart kids were doing well, I thought, well, maybe I'm doing something right. I realized that by the end of the first marking period, I could almost tell you who was going to be doing good work for the rest of the year and who was going to be doing poor work for the rest of the year. But it never occurred to me that I needed to change something so that that pattern didn't stay the same. My first step really in differentiation came in the third week of my third year of teaching in middle school. I was standing in the hall when the kids move from class to class, which can be kind of noisy. And a little guy that I had never seen came up to me. I'm almost 6 feet tall, and he barely, his head didn't even come close to my head. And he was trying to say something to me clearly, but I couldn't understand him. I thought he probably wanted help opening his locker, but I couldn't hear what locker number. And so after 3 or 4 tries, he would put his hand over his mouth every time he tried to say anything, and that didn't help. So finally I said, I tell you what, let's try this again. You keep your hand down, and I'm going to bend down to where you are so I can hear what you're saying. And I think I'll get it this time. He's put his hand back up again, and I kind of gently pulled it down. And what he was saying to me was, I can't read. He was 15 years old. He was getting ready to come into my class of 12-year-olds for the first day because he had missed the first 3 weeks of school. And all of a sudden, it really was as though my life was passing in front of my eyes. I realized a number of things. I don't know how to teach reading. I don't have any materials in my class that are useful to teach reading. I don't know how I'll arrange time to get to him. I don't know how to help the other kids feel like he's a really worthy human being if he can't do much of anything that they're doing. How do I help him realize that he's an important part of the class? My classes weren't as big as some of yours are, but I had 40 students in that class and he made 41. So there really wasn't a whole lot of extra space or time to do anything. But I realized when I was walking in the class with him that he had taken a great risk by coming up to this tall, strange woman and making that confession. And all I could think of in my head was, I can't let him down. I have to send him away at the end of the year better than he was when he came in. So I spent a lot of time that year trying to figure out how to get to him, how to answer my question about what you do to help every kid make a significant contribution to a class and that kind of thing. And the truth is that 2 interesting things happened as a result of that. One was that the most important one was that at the end of the year, he truly didn't know the alphabet when he started. He couldn't define the letters of the alphabet. And by the end of the year, he was reading roughly on a 3rd grade level. which may not seem like much, but it was way better than it had been before. And sometimes even he would look me in the eye. He was so discouraged about himself. He felt so poorly about himself that he didn't make eye contact with anybody. Second thing that happened was that sent me back to get a master's degree in reading so that the next time I identified somebody that needed help, I could help a little bit better. The little boy's name was Golden, which I've always thought was an interesting name. He was really a golden learning opportunity for me. But one of the things that I realized as I was trying to find time to work with him was that there were other kids who weren't nearly as poor in reading as he was, but they really lacked different skills to different degrees. And those kids who were making straight A's that I thought were doing amazing work, I really wasn't challenging them at all. They were just showing up doing what everybody else did, and they were not really feeling engaged with their own growth. So Golden started me down this road, and this I really want you to hear. I taught for 21 years. I spent the rest of all of those years, which was about 19 of them, with my friends learning how to do this so that we were comfortable and confident. It's not something you do the first day and you have it. Neither is it something you can wait 18 years to figure out and suddenly you will have it. It's a step-by-step process. And I want to share a few of those steps with you this morning. And I want you to think along with me about your journey in your classroom to this point. What differences do you notice in your students? What do you already do to reach out to help each kid grow from wherever he is or she is at a particular moment in time with you? What do you do to help yourself better and better understand the differences in the students? And what are the barriers that are in your way to feeling like you can reach out differently to different kids, sometimes in your classroom, to help each of them become the very best that they can be on their own terms? We're going to provide a couple of times for you to be in chat rooms to talk a little bit about what you're hearing. And we'll invite you also all the way through to put your questions in the chat box. And we'll, at the end of the session, we'll take some time for those questions. I will try very hard to answer some of them if I can. And then I really want to encourage you through the process to do what I have learned to do with students. And that is to say to them, your job in this class is to take your next step. My job in this class is to help you take your next step. And the third part of that is my job as a teacher is to keep taking my next step so that while I'm pushing them to get a little bit better every day, I'm pushing myself to do that as well. So deciding to differentiate instruction was my first step. And as I suggested to you with the story about Golden, I began to realize that there was a difference in my teaching when my goal was to get everybody to learn an adequate amount of stuff and be able to give it back to me, versus when I wanted them to really grow to the maximum that they could grow, not the guy next to them, but themselves, to grow as far as they could grow. And so I think I shifted gears in there somewhere from teaching a class where I hoped everybody survived to teaching a class where I hoped everybody really thrived. And those were moments for me that I could tell that my thinking was changing, and so was my teaching. One of the things that I learned to do that I didn't realize was such a problem for so many of us as teachers, and I fully understand why. I did it for a long time and still do at times. I've heard myself say, the students love it when we read that novel. The kids were really restless today. The students did the best job on this project that they've ever done in the past. And when I say the students, I'm speaking of them as though they are one person. If the class as a whole did a nice job on the projects, I can pretty well guarantee you that not everybody did, but I generalized to say that. To say that kids don't care for this, I'm probably overlooking 6 or 8 or 10 kids who in fact do really like that thing. So one of the things Golden taught me in the beginning was to try as hard as I could within the difficulties of teaching to start thinking about a student each student rather than always seeing the students, because people are lost in that crowd when I do that. I'm sure that some of you feel this way as well, probably most of you. The thing that kept me in teaching, I was an accidental teacher. I didn't mean to keep teaching for very long. I just needed a job at the moment, and I got one in the middle of a school year. The kids' lives fascinated me. The notion that there were all these young human beings that were going to change right in front of my eyes. They're funny, they're sad, they're tragic, they're exciting. Their excitement gets me excited. And so one of the things that I began to do when I started evolving toward trying to think about a student rather than the students was to begin to try to figure out how I could know them a little bit better every day. Never have perfect knowledge of that many kids. I was teaching 150 students a year, and I'm sure some of you are teaching more than that. It's not perfect, but if I'm trying, I do begin to see them as individuals. And over time, I can learn a lot of strategies to understand more about them as people and much more about them and the trajectory or the course of their work. When I did that, my work was much more energized. It was much more interesting to be thinking about what I could do that would help these 4 students develop more, or what I could do to help this student who understands so much about this topic move ahead. I just felt much more like I was alive and creative than I did when I was doing the same thing for everybody. And not only did it energize my work, but the kids really came to life. I think there's no doubt that they understood that the connection I was developing with them was important to me. And of course, that did what it always does for people. It made them feel more important and more central in our class as well. So one of the things that I figured out over time, not early on, I've made every mistake you can make, and I've made them dozens of times. In the beginning, I would think, well, you know, when I'm teaching this thing, I really don't need to do the same thing with everybody tomorrow. I've got some kids who would benefit from, excuse me, benefit from meeting with me for a little while. I've got some kids who are ready to move on with this particular idea. I have some students who can take some small steps, but aren't really ready to go the full distance. So I think for a little while, I'm going to try a couple of things going on to see if I can reach more of them better. And so I began to sometimes teach the whole class, of course, and sometimes say, okay, I'm going to ask you to do a couple of different things now, and here's what I want you to do, and here's how you'll know what to do. I didn't talk with the kids about it. I just said, here's what I'd like you to do, and explained it, and we sort of went off. But sometimes they'd get confused, or because it was not the case in their other classes that they kept working in different small groups and moving around a lot, that I think they were confused. And so finally, it occurred to me that we'd do better in the class if the students and I could have a conversation about what I was trying to do with them. By the way, sorry, I've just waked up over here and I seem to have a little morning tickle in my throat. I'm talking to you about differentiation. It didn't have a name when I was doing it. We referred to it as the name of the class that I was teaching. So I didn't use that term with the kids, but it did occur to me that I would do better and they would do better if we had a conversation about what was in my head about why I was trying to do different things with them. So I would start by trying to help them understand why we didn't always work together all the time and why we did work together some of the time. And then because I was talking with them about it, the change began to make sense to them. In addition to that, they contributed to my conversation with them. And so some of the ideas became theirs. And we began to build an idea at the beginning of the year of what we could do to make the class better. And my introduction to them really often in regard to the why was to say to them, can you remember a time when you were in a class where the teacher was working really hard to help you learn, but you were confused and you didn't know what was going on and you couldn't figure that out. And I would tell them my worst experience in school, which was in an algebra class in middle school, where I truly had no clue about what the teacher was doing from day one. And when I looked around, it seemed to me like everybody else did, which made me feel even more stupid. And so I kept losing self-confidence. But every day, because each day built on the other one, I would get a little bit more lost. I still have a reasonable case of math phobia as a result of that class. And the kids could all tell me times, whether it was in a sport they were playing or in a community thing they were doing or in a class they'd taken, where they were lost and they didn't know how to get unlost, and it seemed hopeless. And then I'd ask them if there was ever a time where somebody was trying to teach them something, again, maybe in school, maybe in a sport, maybe in a hobby, and the teacher was teaching as hard as he or she could and teaching them stuff they already knew. And after a while, they kind of wanted to scream and just say, could I just move on and do something here? And many of them could tell those stories. And so my question to them was, do you think we could create a classroom that was a pretty good fit for everybody? So everybody was a lot of the time working kind of where they needed to be and moving on from that point. And so it wasn't a mystery to them after that why we were doing what we were doing, because we had talked about so many reasons and they had shared their stories and they made sense to them. It was familiar. We had the conversations about why we might do different things at different times, and particularly about how we could do them better throughout the year. So every once in a while we'd stop and I'd go back and say, remind me what we said about this. What was the reason that we decided to do this part? Is it going as smoothly as it could? What can I do better to help you work more effectively? And what can you do to help all of us work more effectively? And so we kind of built the idea through the year. We talked about how we were going to do what we did. I used some analogies with them, and I'm going to show you a couple of those in a minute, so that I was kind of making a connection between something that had happened in their lives or something that seemed familiar to them with that notion of differentiation. We talked about how it might look. If I needed to work with a group of 5 students, what would the rest of you need to be doing while I'm doing that so that everything's effective? If you're working in small groups, there are lots of us in here. If the conversations get too noisy, how will we make sure we can handle that okay? If you're sometimes working on different work, how could we set it up so you could turn in that work at different times? How would we know what to do? How can we set up the classroom so you know what to do when I'm working with somebody so that I can concentrate on that and then can kind of come around and help you? What are some problems you could see that we might have, and how could we avoid some of those problems? Or if we have them, what can we do to fix them? What will I need to do to make this work, and what will you need to do to make this work? So we had kind of an ongoing conversation. And if we start school here in August, if you had come into my class by the end of September, the students could have explained to you what was going on at least as well as I could have, if not better. They had helped develop it. It made sense to them. When it wasn't working, we figured it out together and got smoother as the year went on. And of course, we got better every year as I got better with the ideas as well. So here's one of the analogies that I used with them. A friend of mine drew this cartoon for me, but I used to go to the lost and found. I don't know if you do this in India, but kids in the US seem to leave things at school sometimes. So we end up, with a book that got lost or a jacket that got left someplace when it wasn't. You don't do jackets in India too much, probably too much at the time, but a coat that had gotten left at school. So I went to the lost and found, and I would get the biggest jacket I could find and the smallest one I could find. When the kids came in the classroom to class that day, I'd stop a couple of them and I'd ask a child who was very tall and a kid who was very short if they'd mind doing something with me. And tell them, I'm going to ask you to put on a piece of clothes that isn't yours. If you don't want to do that, it's okay. It's not a problem. Generally, they thought it would be kind of fun. So what I had in the classroom then was a real tall kid that was squunched up in his jacket or hers, and a little kid who's wearing this thing that's way too big. And I'd ask them how that felt. And this is the first week of school sometime. And the class would giggle, of course, because they were middle schoolers. And the kid would say, you know, my sleeves are so long, they're just flopping, and giggle. And the kid would say, I can't breathe with this thing on me. And after they had giggled for a while, I'd say, okay, now I want to ask you a question. What if you had to wear this all day? What if I told you I needed you to wear this all day? How would that feel? And they could begin to say that it wasn't so bad to do it for a couple of minutes, but if it kept happening, it would feel awkward. And I would say, what if you had to wear it all year? And then they began to realize that they would start disliking coming to class, and that perhaps their friends would make fun of them, and that they wouldn't even feel comfortable doing normal things like eating in the cafeteria. And so what I would do then was move to an analogy and say to them, what if we could set up a classroom where there were lots of different sizes and styles of clothes? And much of the time there'd be a size or a style that was really your thing. Would that be better than this? And why would it be? What difference would it make to you? So that was one way to introduce the conversation to them. Another thing that I did sometimes was a role play where kids would come into the classroom. Once again, I'd stop a couple of them, ask them if they'd be willing to do sort of a show thing in front of the class. And in this particular thing, I would give one of the students an index card looking like this, and ask them to, with the other student, to do what the card says. So on this first one, I'm playing the physician, and the kid who's the parent explains to me that he thinks his son has poison ivy because he's got a rash all over his arms. And yesterday he helped cut the grass in the front yard, and that's probably where the poison ivy came from. He went through an explanation, and the little kid who has the poison ivy is just standing there scratching and doesn't have to say anything. And I would say to the little boy, wait, that must be really uncomfortable. It's hot outside and that's itchy. I'm so sorry you feel that way. Here's some cough medicine, take it, and I hope you feel better. And the kids would look at me like something was crazy. I did that through 4 or 5 sets of kids. One kid had a bad stomach and I gave him cough medicine. Another kid might have had a broken arm and I gave him cough medicine. The last kid finally had a cough and got the cough medicine. And I would say to the kids, why am I doing this? This is a different class, a different year, not the same year. I did different things to help me not get bored. And the kids would say, you're a lousy doctor. And we talked then about what their mother would do if she had taken them to a physician, and no matter what the problem was, they got cough medicine every time. And what was the comparison between that and always having the same lesson in class all the time? And they got that, and that would, just like the clothing thing, kind of help us launch the year. So then we began to, on the very first week of school, to begin to take some small steps together to create a classroom where several things could happen at the same time, where the kids knew what to do to keep it smooth, where we had materials in the right place and kids doing a lot of the work that needed to be done to make it go smoothly. And among those things was, for me, making sure that the kids really were going to be successful in whatever I asked them to do. I didn't want to start with something that was going to be chaotic or messy or noisy all over the place. I wanted to ask them to do something that I knew that they could do. And so I would start with something that was fairly familiar. Much of the time, during the time I was teaching, working with this process of teaching, I was teaching English. I taught history sometimes and I taught German sometimes, but the majority of my students were in English classes. And they were accustomed to, or I could help them become accustomed to, 2 things that would be a part of our year all year. One was doing some student choice reading. And I might ask them to read a little bit in class, something that they wanted to read for, let's say, 10 minutes. And they could bring a book from home or the library. We had some things in the class that they could choose from. I didn't care if it was a magazine about soccer, if that's what they really wanted to read about. I just wanted them to read. And when they did that, our rule in this class was you were absolutely silent. You were focused on what you were doing. If the world fell apart around you, you were going to still sit there and keep reading that stuff. And so they learned how to do that. They learned what the expectations were. And they understood, how to get the materials, how to put them away, that they weren't supposed to talk. A second thing that I did with them was keeping a journal, which they shared just with me. This was just to write some things that they thought were interesting in their life, something fun they did at home over the weekend, something they were hoping was going to happen next month, what they thought of class and how they might make it better. And so once again, with those journals, which were nothing more than notebook paper stapled together, they would just write, and then there was a place they'd put them on my desk and I'd write them a note back in it. Practice with writing, a way to connect with me, a way for me to get to know them a little better. So in the beginning, when we started doing more than one thing, I would say to them, I want you to read today for 10 minutes. If I said 10 minutes, I was pretty sure they could do it for 12 or 13 minutes before they got restless. And I wanted to stop it before they got into trouble with it. So I'd ask them to do something for a length of time that was slightly shorter than what I thought they could manage, because I wanted them to be successful. And when we were all really good with that reading thing, it was very smooth. Then I'd ask half of them to do the writing and half of them to do the reading. And when they finished that for 10 minutes or 8 minutes or 7 minutes or 12 minutes, however long I asked them to do it, then I would say, did it bother you that some kids were writing and some were reading? Let's talk about that. Usually they didn't even notice, but if they did, they were pretty much fine with it. But if they weren't, we'd talk about what the problem was and what we might do to fix it. So giving them one thing to do till they succeed, then a second thing to go with it. And then after they'd done that a few times, I would begin to call some students up to my desk so that I could sit and talk with 2 or 3 students about something that they needed my help with. And then I'd maybe let those students go back to their desk and call 2 or 3 more up. And at the end of that time, I'd say to the kids, did you notice that I had some folks coming to my desk to talk with me today? Did that bother you? Was it confusing to you? Wonder what was happening? Usually not, but if they did, we would handle that. And that's really kind of how I started the process. I didn't say, okay, today we're going to do 5 things, go for it. I tried really, really hard to make sure that they understood each step of it, what was required, and that we could move through that smoothly. Took small steps. I learned to give really clear directions. I was very, very careful thinking through at home exactly what I wanted to say to them, if it needed to be on paper or on a board so they could see it, to make sure that I was as clear as I could be, and also teaching them that it was really, really important to listen the first time, because I was not going to be available after that to answer questions. We also talked about how they could get help from peers and what was an appropriate way to do that and what inappropriate ways to do that were. I tried to stop them while they were still working well, so that the sense of being able to work independently just made sense to them. They could see it happening. We talked fairly often, briefly, about how that went. We said, this is what was supposed to happen. How'd you feel about it? Did it work for you? Were the directions clear? Did you know how to get help if they weren't? Were you sure where things were? What do we need to do tomorrow to make it better? My analogy for this has always been, if you've flown kites in your life, I grew up on a beach and I love flying kites there, but the trouble is if you let that string out too fast, the wind takes it and it gets away from you and it rips. What I really was trying to do with the kids in creating a class that could have multiple things happening at the same time was to let that kite string out slowly enough so that the kite would fly and be beautiful rather than flipping around and becoming a disaster. So we're going to ask you now in a chat room to talk with each other for a few minutes, and someone will monitor that. And when it's time, we'll put you back in the mainstream so we can work together. What's in your mind after hearing these ideas about differentiation, just the very beginning ideas? What do you see as potential benefits of working to get just a little bit better each day, each week, with understanding some different needs that your kids have and figuring out how you can go about addressing individual needs and small group needs, as well as the needs of the class as a whole? What are your concerns? And what questions would you like to pose at this point? You can go ahead and put a question from your group in the chat box if you want, or enter that later. But take just a few minutes and work with this, and then in 4 or 5 minutes, we'll get back together.
Thank you, Carol. So we're all ready to get into our breakout rooms. Just have these questions in mind as points for discussion. I'm opening the breakout rooms. You will get an invite. Please accept that invite, and you will have around 4 to 5 people in the room. Do discuss this, and you will be back into the main room in 5 minutes. We will announce the closure, so you'll get a message, and then you can leave the room. I hope it's clear, and I'll just announce the breakout room. Anybody who hasn't got an invite? Yeah, okay. More people are going. Great. Nidhi, you haven't got an invite? Nidhi Grover? Akila? Yes, I think everybody is in their rooms, so that's fine. Oops. Is your throat okay now, Carol?
Okay. Everybody's busy now, huh? Good.
Yes.
Neha, I'm running a little behind where I thought I might be at this point. So I'll at the end, when it's time to put them in another group, I may just stop at a place that you're not expecting me to stop and skip over to that slide so they have the second
Okay.
opportunity.
Okay, fine. So we should have them back in another 2 minutes.
That's fine.
Yeah. If I announce the breakout room closure now, it will take a minute for everybody to come back. Okay.
Sorry, say that again.
I'm announcing the closure of the breakout rooms. So they will take 1 more minute to come back.
Sure.
Yes. So Carol, they're coming back into the main room.
So should I begin now?
No, just a minute more. Yes, you can.
Okay. Welcome back. I hope you enjoyed talking to each other, even though it was brief. For some reason now my slides are not moving. Do you have any idea about that?
You want to share it again?
Okay, here we go. Okay, so I want to continue with you just a little bit. Remember, again, my hope is to give you sort of a sense of growth over time, and some things that I felt like I got better in doing and that was advantageous to the students in terms of their learning. So we spent some time early on just sort of figuring out structures and basic routines and learned routines for how to do a variety of things and start and stop class smoothly. And over time, I got better and better at being able to think of what the class needed to do, the students, but also because of using formative assessment, understand here are 6 kids now that need some additional work with this. Here are 4 students who are very good with this, and I can give them something to do that's interesting to them so that they can go more deeply into what they were doing than they would have been able to do had we all been working together. One of my goals was to find a balance in the classroom of stability and flexibility is what this should say. Oh yeah, flexibility and stability, yeah. I needed to be able to shift gears and do 2 or 3 or 4 things at the time sometimes, but I also needed the kids to be very comfortable about how that worked so that they were not feeling like the earth was moving under them. And I also needed to know that when I asked them to do something, it would work smoothly so that I wasn't nervous about that all the time. So we continued to work in that way of what can I do to make it flexible, but that flexibility is predictable both to me and to the students so that it wasn't confusing and chaotic. I got better at using a wide range of instructional strategies that made it easier for me to differentiate. I use learning contracts a lot, for example. Learning contracts now electronically are sometimes called hyperdocs. Very same thing as a learning contract, is just an electronic version of one. I learned to have kids doing book clubs to read things where we were all working with the same skills and the same ideas, but sometimes the book club book for some students would be more accessible in reading level than for others. Sometimes they were grouped together by a topic or a genre, a kind of literature that they like to work with. Many different instructional strategies that let you reach out somewhat differently to different kids rather than having them all always do the same activities. A simple example of that would be learning to do a think, pair, share, where I ask a question that's not a right answer question, but a thought question. Give them a minute to write what their thinking is, then ask them to turn to another student and share what they wrote together and see if they can reach a conclusion. And then later, when they got good with the think, pair, share, getting in that and out of it, I would do a think, pair, share, square, which means I ask the question, student writes an idea for an answer, gets to a partner and talks with that person, and then that pair finds another pair and repeats the process. I could vary the questions sometimes, but this is really helpful for students who need a little more certainty, need a little more input as they're moving through a process rather than sitting in class grasping for air and not being quite sure where they are. By the way, after the think, pair, share and the think, pair, share, square, we would have a class discussion so that we could kind of come together in a consensus about something. I was much more comfortable with saying to the students, okay, remember, this is what we're trying to master right now. This idea, this skill, this thing that we're trying to understand. I have two choices for you to do today. Here's one, here's the other. Which do you think would be the one most likely to move you forward? Or sometimes I would just give two different assignments to kids. I would give them choices of homework fairly often. We're coming up on a test with this. Remember, it's going to have these three things on it. If you think you need more work with this topic, here's your assignment. If you think you need more work with this, here's your assignment, and so forth. And there are strategies, easy strategies for checking the homework when kids come back into class, even if they've been doing different assignments, a strategy called homework checkers that works wonderfully with that. And interestingly, with things like the choice of homework, students did better because they could actually use their time well. And the homework checkers strategy gave them much more ownership of answers, where they came from, being able to defend their thinking and that kind of thing. I worked with them on effective discussions, both in the class so that everybody was speaking and not just a few students, and in small group discussions so that they learned how to conduct those discussions themselves and learned to be much better at giving feedback and asking questions. And again, could work in smaller groups with different questions, sometimes different discussions, but at least in a surrounding where more people had a voice. I use things like learning contracts, learning menus. Now I would probably be using some hyperdocs. Gave them interest-based assignments so that some days, if you were more interested in studying this aspect of something we were working with, you could meet with this group. If you'd rather approach the idea from this interest, you could work with this group. And got so that frequently the students had options to do independent investigations of something that mattered to them kind of in the background. But they were learning, again, how to find information, how to distill it, how to analyze it and conclude the most important findings from what they developed, and also to create ways of sharing what they learned, based more on how professionals share their information. And I got very good at small group instruction, meeting with 2, 3, 5, 7 kids at a time, and then sending them back to do whatever was going on and pulling up 4 or 5 more kids, walking around in the class between those small groups so that I can answer questions for students and that kind of thing. Kids got so they were very good at helping one another learn. And so we did collaborative teamwork where they were helping each other develop mastery in certain areas. This is a very simple, more contemporary example of sort of a student choice thing. This is an elementary task for students who are studying volcanoes. And they would have a sheet of a screen or a sheet of paper, depending on how you want to present it to them, where they would have 3 icons. And on each block, they would have a question that went with it, what makes the earth move, and a link that would be there. And so for the first box, they'd click on the link and answer the question. The links might be varied. I might, if I had students whose language was different from the classroom language, I might use a link that has lots of visuals in it and less language for them to look at, for example. Then when they finish that, they'd go to the second link and write what they now thought about why the earth blows up, why the earth moves, and record their answer there. And the I wonder piece is what's something else I'd really like to know about this. And then I might give them a chance to learn some more about what volcanoes are like, why the earth blows up. I could do that with articles or videos or mini lectures, text, stories, photographs, some combination. I might choose articles or text at 2 different levels of sophistication. I might, and give kids different links to that. I might, for some kids, put more visuals or art in their work because they are very visual with what they do in class, but I can assign different things at different levels of complexity fairly easy there. And then to sort of let me know where they got, I'd give them one more set of work, another icon, a question, and a link. So you're going from here's something still now that's going to try to bring this together. I used to think what's at the top of the page. I now think this. I used to wonder something, and now I hope I've gotten an answer, but what am I still wondering? That's a way to give kids an assignment that looks very much alike, but they can be working with different levels of complexity. This is not something I would have done the first week or the first month and probably didn't even know to do anything like this the first year, but it gives you a little sense of becoming more sophisticated than just read and write a journal entry. There's a science agenda there that you might want to look at in the handout that is available to you today if you'd like to see a little bit more sophisticated example. Along the way, here are some big lessons that I learned. My students did better when I taught them for meaning and understanding than when I just tried to cover a lot of material with them. I could give students many different things to do that were lively and interesting and relevant to them, and embed in those tasks the key skills and the key vocabulary that was critical for the content that I was teaching in the context of work that really engaged their minds and energized them. I learned to make formative assessment right at the heart of what I was doing, so that I had a mechanism for following each student's progress as we went, which of course then helped me really understand what I needed to do with the students to help them be able to move forward on their own terms. So my planning got so that it had whole class segments and small group and large group individual segments. And I'm going to hit this with you really briefly because we need to give you a chance to talk and still have a chance for a question or two. What do you need to do with your whole class in an assignment next week, for example, or in a particular unit? When would it be handy, if you were comfortable with it and the kids were comfortable with it, to have small groups working together, not always on the same thing? And when would it be really handy for you to have a chance for kids to practice what they need to practice, to meet with you or to move further in their curriculum? So these are some things that I found it was useful to do with the whole class. Again, you can take a look back at that later and sort of see whether this matches what you would think. What do you feel is really critical to do with the entire class? What's most important in terms of content, in terms of sharing, in terms of planning? And then when you have individual segments, I understand that many of you, if not all of you, will be starting school this year, will be teaching this year virtually. In the US, it's a mixed bag, some starting virtually, some starting in person. But it's likely for us that we'll go back and forth during the year. And one thing that I think is really helpful is that if you can start a routine in one of those settings that you can use in the other setting, then it's less confusing if you have transitions. And so if I were doing that, I probably would have a predictable schedule in the day where there's some whole class stuff, small group, individual, coming together, breaking apart. And I would use the technology that I would use online in the classroom as well, so that the kids are practicing that and are comfortable with it. So another few minutes together. What ideas can you pick up even from this brief introduction that you might consider using with your students to address needs of kids who inevitably come to us at different places in their learning? How do the tips for differentiating with whole group, small group, individual, using the technology, for example, where students are going to post their work online, have them do that in class as well so that it reinforces the routines that you're looking at? What else would you do to make the online work align with what you might do in person so that it's reinforcing? And again, what questions would you like to pose? And would encourage you to put some of those in the chat box now. And in a few minutes when we come back, one of your hosts will read a question to us so we can all know which one we're working on, and especially me, so I can hear clearly. And then I'll answer a few of those for you. So back in the chat room for a few minutes.
So the same routine follows, and I'm opening all the rooms. You will get a message 60 seconds before the room's going to close. And we have about, Carol, 3 minutes. Do we have 3 minutes, Carol? Yeah.
I'm not hearing you.
Okay. Yeah, that's fine. Carol, should we time it for 3 minutes or 5
whatever
minutes?
You think. Whatever you think is fine. We're right at 60 minutes. And so
Right.
if I even had 10 minutes for questions, they could stay in the chat room 4 or 5 minutes and it would be fine. We'd be just
Okay.
fine.
Okay.
when we get back together, Neha, there's something that you do at your end that makes it possible for me to move the slides. Right now, they're frozen again and I can't move them. So whatever
No,
it was that
I didn't
they
do
won't-
anything.
well, they won't move right now again. So somehow
Oh,
the same thing happened when they came out of the chat room before. I couldn't move them. And then after a few seconds, I could. I don't know.
I
don't know if
had.
that happened before.
Yeah, I don't know if it's connected to the breakout rooms in any manner.
Yeah, I don't know. Well, hopefully they'll move, but if not, we'll figure it out.
Yeah.
Neha, have you been able to read the questions out for Carol?
No, just going to do that.
You do.
Did you break out?
Yeah, but I lost connection, so I came back in.
You don't want me to assign you back to the room, right?
No, it's fine.
Okay. So you want to read them with her?
I don't have access to
Or you
them.
don't have the access to the chat. Okay, Carol, if I can read some questions out to you. Read out some questions.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Go ahead.
So, yeah. Children learn at different paces. How do we keep that in mind while differentiating? Then there's one about how can a teacher manage a classroom and meet individual needs effectively? So how do you juggle between the whole class and making sure that each person has been, needs have been addressed? There was one specific question for how are hyperdocs similar to learning contracts?
One question about what with the contracts?
I think you referred to hyperdocs, similar to learning contracts. So one person's asked, how are they similar to learning contracts?
I still missed that last part. They asked, I mentioned the learning contracts. I mentioned hyperdocs. I'm not hearing the last part of what you're saying.
How are they similar? How are they similar?
How are they similar? Okay.
Yeah, okay.
So I can actually go back when I can move the slides to that,
Yes.
to those two examples, and I can share that with them.
Does providing instructions in dual languages count for differentiation?
How do you use two different languages in differentiation? Is that it?
Yeah. So she's asking that if I provide instruction in two languages, is that called differentiation? And one was about how to make lesson plans, which I think you kind of have, spoken about in those slides where you spoke about individual, the different
That
segments.
one really is asking how a lesson plan would look, kind of, if you did
Yes.
a lesson plan. How would it look?
Yeah.
I don't think I can get to an example of that fast enough. I have many of them, but I can try to explain to them what I would do. Can you tell me again, I have three questions down here now. One is it differentiation if you do instruction in two languages? One is a comparison between a hyperdoc and a learning contract. And another one is how the lesson plans look. You mentioned one before that. Can you tell me what one of the early questions was that I didn't quite hear?
It was about pace. If children learn at a different pace, then how do you manage differentiation?
Because of the tight class, small space in a classroom, is that what they're asking?
No, the pace of learning, that children have a different pace. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, pace of learning, okay.
So I'm announcing the closure. Wrap-ups.
Say that again.
She's closing the breakout rooms. They'll be back soon.
Okay.
There is some background sound. Not sure where it's coming from. I think we can begin.
Okay. Thanks for your conversations there. Your hosts have shared with me several of the questions that you ask, and so I will try to answer them at least briefly. One person asked a really good question that lets me know I was skipping a step somewhere. That person asked whether you would call it differentiation if a teacher wrote instructions in 2 different languages. And my answer to that is yes, absolutely. And the step that I skipped is this. What you're trying to do with differentiation is understand where kids are in their learning development and help move them on from that point. Anything that you can help a kid do to learn as efficiently and as effectively and as fully as possible can be differentiation. So if I'm meeting with a small group of kids, that may well be at some point because I have 7 or 8 students who really are answering all of the math questions right now with real efficiency, and they can unpack their thinking. I want to meet with them to give them some things to do that aren't going to be automatic for them and have conversations with them about how they would move into that space. With Golden, I need to spend some time with him, obviously trying to figure out what we can do to get the alphabet going in some reading that he can handle. John Hattie in his work, and you may know his work, people around the world tend to use it a lot, calls that +1 learning. He says every student should go to school every day to move 1 step forward. In the algebra class where I was, I moved at least 1 step backwards every day. I have been in classes where I was better than I was in there, where I waited a really long time for other kids to catch up so that we could move forward. The goal of differentiation, one goal is +1 learning. Another goal is to let kids pursue their interests, whether it's a way to express something or the kind of reading they like to do or something that they're just dying to find out about. I had a student who came to me once and said, I really want to learn about theories of extinction of the dinosaurs. I was his English teacher. And so, a typical not very bright teacher question, I said, that's really interesting, Jeff. Why are you telling me that? And he said, and he was really serious about this, he said, I have so many questions about that. And there's never time in my day to learn anything that I want to learn. And unless somebody gives me permission, it's going to be 10 more years before I can really dig deeply into that. And he was right. He was going to be at the end of college before he could do that. So he and I worked out a plan so that he did the things that he and I both knew he needed to do in class. And he spent the rest of the time on the dinosaur thing. And it was the most remarkable piece of work I've ever seen. That's kind of a big example of it. But I want kids to be able to build on their interests. So if you have students who are not all speaking the same language as their first language in the classroom, and you say, it's going to be more efficient if I write this in 2 languages because these kids will do better here and these kids will do better there, that's differentiation. You might then ask yourself, is there a way that either you or they can find resources in their first language? Would it be helpful if you gave them permission to write their work in their own language first and then translate it so that they could get the maximum from you? You might ask yourself, when you're asking them to show what they've learned on a certain day, and some students don't speak the first language in the classroom, to give them the option of drawing what they think is going on and labeling it briefly rather than writing a paragraph to explain to you. And all of those moves would be to say, what can I do to help this kid learn the most possible today and to demonstrate the most fully today what they've learned? So yes, realizing that you've got kids who speak different languages, and some of the kids will struggle with the directions so much that they can't even get to the work. So therefore you write the directions in a language that will work better for them. That's absolutely an example of differentiation. Somebody else asked another question that's a really good one. And it's something I've never been any good at, so I don't know that I can help you too much, but how do you handle the pace of learning in a differentiated classroom? In other words, if you have some students who are really struggling with the first topic that you work with students on, you can't stay there all year trying to make that work. So what I ended up learning to do, and still did this in my college classes as well, is to say I can give about this much time to this topic without beginning to detract from other important things. One thing I learned to do, though, was rather than covering everything in that topic that I had always done, to say to myself, what do I have to do with them so that they're prepared to move forward? And then I tried to set timelines for the kids that seemed to be doable and realistic. It was not uncommon for me to realize on Wednesday that I have given the kids something to do that they can't really finish on Wednesday. It's not their fault, it's mine. And so I would say to them, okay, put your stuff away, remember what you do so you can figure out where you are tomorrow. And tomorrow we're going to come back and work on this a little bit longer. But at the end of the line down there somewhere, it needs to be, this is when the end of the unit test is going to be, or this is when your product comes in that your performance assessment that you've done to show what you've learned, and then we're going to move on. But here's an important thing. Golden hadn't learned to read by the time we got to the end of the first unit. He couldn't do anything in the unit very much. I mean, he could do some things with us, but he couldn't read anything. So there, if you have a student who's really struggling mathematically, it's just maybe even a learning disability in math, I'm going to continue with that student on things that are really important for him to work with into the second unit. In other words, I'm going to try to see if I can move him forward and backwards at the same time, so that while the class is having to move forward, and to some degree, he's going to be moving forward with us because I don't want to dig a bigger hole, I'm going to give that kid some homework every once in a while that gets him to practice some of those things in the first unit that he's not really understanding yet, and that are going to continue to be a problem for him down the road. So you do have to set some parameters. You have to generally stick with those. But when the unit ends, if you have students who still need a few really critical things in the past, then you can handle that through small group instruction, individual work, homework that has some parts of that in it, and so on. Another question that somebody asked, and I wish I had a visual of this to show you, but it was an important question for me, is how do your lesson plans look when you're planning like this? And over time, this is what I began to do for myself, and it's what then I taught my students at the university to do, and with people in workshops. I actually just created a written or online 2-column sheet to fill in. And the left-hand column is what all of us in the class are going to do as a whole. And the right-hand column is any of the stuff that's going to be broken out or differentiated. So if in the top left box, which is the whole group piece, I'm going to introduce a unit today, then I would jot there what that's going to be. What are we going to do first, second, and third there? And it's the whole class. And then if the next thing that I'm going to do is to explain to the whole class a scavenger hunt that I want them to do online for some information, then the second step for the whole class is explaining those directions to them. If the third step is that different students are going to be doing that scavenger hunt different ways, then that would go in the third box in the second column. So step 1, whole class, step 2, whole class, step 3 in the individual or small group column. And my lesson plans are just back and forth, so I can see here we're together, here we're together, here we break apart, here we stay apart, here we come back together, here we break apart, and you can just look at it that way. And it's really easy to follow. And it's something that really helped me learn the rhythm of shifting from whole class to small group and making time for it. It's far easier than filling out any lesson template that I've ever seen. And so if I had a big complicated template that I was supposed to fill out for lesson plans and really needed to do that because it's expected, I'd do that and then I'd attach the single sheet or the column thing to it, I think. One final question that somebody asked, and for some reason, again, I don't know what the scoop is, but I can't. This is what happened. It's odd when we went into the, okay, here we go. I can now move. I'm going to try to go back. Well, no, I can't either. So the question was, that's very strange. The question was, what's the similarity or difference between a learning contract and a hyperdoc? For me, a learning contract, and this was, when we weren't using technology with apps all over the place, was a way to say, there's some things I want all of you to do, and there's some things that I want different ones of you to do differently. And so I'm going to give you an assignment that says, here's your job for the next hour, or the next 3 days, or the next week, or even longer than that. And here are things that you have to do, and here are things you have choices in. So I might ask students in a learning contract to be sure that you have read these 2 stories, or this chapter in this article from a history assignment. But the contract might ask different students to read different articles. There are websites in the US that we use a lot, and I'm sure you probably have more of them in India because your technology is swell, where a teacher can go and find readings at different readability levels on the same topic. So all the students might be reading about this particular event in history, but some of them are reading it at a more complex level and some less so. And then I might ask them to share with me what they think are the 4 most important ideas in that article and why they think they're important. Some students, I might just say, share what you think the 4 most important points are and why you say that. Other students, I might actually give a sheet to fill out. So it says point number 1, why is it important? Point number 2, why is it important? Because those students need the structure to be able to follow through. They might have a choice at the end of something that they're going to create that demonstrates what they have learned about how this scientific process works or how these events in history unfolded. And so the contract is to say, here are things that you need to finish by this date using whatever kind of specified materials or ways of expressing things. You can work in whichever order makes sense to you. You can sit in the room where you'd like to. You can consult with friends. You can work on some of it at home or not. I mean, you can modify those things as you want to, but your job is to get it done. My job is just to support you. I'm not going to be the teacher and tell you every step of the way what you need to do. Do this first, do this second, do this third. And as long as you're doing that well, then my agreement with you is that I'll let you work independently. Your agreement with me is you'll do that well independently and ask for help when you need it. If I see that it's not working for you well right now, I can be a teacher and I can ask you to do this, 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 and this, and then give it to me. My students really love the freedom of that and the sense of being independent. And it helped me learn to teach them how to plan their time better and how to monitor their work and get help when they needed it and that kind of thing. But a contract specifies things they need to do by a certain time with whatever specifications I put there. learning contracts, when I was doing them, were paper documents. Now with a hyperdoc, you could take exactly the same thing and embed links. You could give them choices of videos as well as links to text. You could give them podcasts to listen to. You could tell them to listen or watch, look at, read at least 3 things in this list. But it's exactly the same thing. It's an electronic thing that says you need to do these things by this date. Here are materials you can use. You have these freedoms. You have these requirements. Here are what the criteria for success are. And so they both are the same in that way. It's a way of specifying a sequence of things that need to get finished by a certain date, but the contract lets you vary parts of it based on students' needs and interests. And the hyperdoc lets you connect to things electronically, which we used to sort of have to provide on paper or always in a library or that kind of thing. Much more freedom in terms of where you go with that. So I think we're probably past where we needed to be. So let me just sort of conclude with you really quickly. Teachers will say to me sometimes, I don't see how you can do all this. I didn't see that either on day one. I saw a little more at the end of week 1 than I did at the end of week 1 than day 1. I was better with it at the end of my first year of working this way. I had several colleagues that we continued to meet as a group over many, many years trying to figure things out. And when I left public school after 20 years of doing this, I understood it well, until I went to the university and started doing research and realized how much I didn't know. And then I could sort of fix things better. And the thing that was most wonderful was at the university, I could go in so many people's classes around the world and think, well, why didn't I think of that? Well, gosh, that's wonderful what he's doing there. I never thought to do that. And occasionally, what that's happening right there, that's not so good. I don't want to do that. It's for me, truly has been a 50-year journey. And I'm much, much better at it than I was in the beginning. And I still have an immense amount to learn. So the trick, I think, is to decide, do you see differences in your kids that would be beneficial to address? And if so, what can you do to begin to move yourself down that pike one step at a time, and every step you take will benefit some of your students. Thank you for your time today. The goal is just to get you to think and have a conversation. So do that. Wherever your starting point is, take your next step.
Thank you, Carol. Thank you so much for that. It was absolutely wonderful. I think we feel that this is like a really good first step. You've created that entire sequence of get the culture first in, get it in slowly. There's no need to rush it, get to know the children, and then think about the strategies, think of the scaffolding, and then get the movement in terms of each child being able to take the next step. So I think that's absolutely wonderful. We feel that we would definitely want to get you back in here because there's so many questions that are coming in about like, how do we go deeper into looking at children with special needs. We're looking at, the kind of secondary school classrooms with a huge pressure of the public examination. So how do we do all kinds, of differentiation in different classes, different children? And I'm sure we'll be getting back to you at some point saying, we need the next level. This is about making it easy. We now need to talk about the complexities in it. So I hope that's okay with you and that you'd be happy to come back again and again to India, even if virtually.
That would be a pleasure. I've enjoyed being with you. I enjoyed meeting your crew in the beginning and appreciate everybody's time and thinking today.
Great. So I think we could all put in our chat what we would like to say to Carol, and we will send that to her as an email, a big thank you email. We would be very happy to have all of you let us know what you would like to know more about. So do fill the Padlet that we've given you. Get as many things out there as you want to, because this is the beginning of a lovely journey that we are all going to take together. This is learning together the best way possible. And we are really happy that you all made it here, and see you again. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoy your evening.
Thanks. And you, your day. I know you had to wake up really early in the morning. Thank you.
Thank you, Kavita and Adhyayan team.
Thanks, Tushar.
Thank you
for
so
your-
much. Thank you for your time.
Yeah, hi.
Hey, Tushar.
Hi. So wonderful to listen to your voice.
Long time since I've heard yours too.
Yeah, great connecting virtually.
Right. Okay, Gauri, we can stop the streaming as well. So,
Yeah, I'll do that.
yeah, thank you. Very good.
Interesting. Now the slides will move again. I don't know what that is. It happened at the chat room both times. Have no idea.